The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, breaking the silence that had settled over Dover Air Force Base like a funeral shroud. Major Jake Anchor Morrison had been staring at his discharge papers for the better part of an hour, the coffee in his mug long since gone cold. 22 years of service, reduced to a stack of forms and a handshake from a colonel who barely looked him in the eye. His daughter Emma's school photos smiled back at him from his desk. Third-grade graduation, missing tooth grin, completely unaware that Daddy's flying days were numbered. The voice that cut through the static wasn't from base operations. It wasn't from air traffic control. It was weathered, confident, carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned officers straighten their spines without thinking. Dover Control, this is Ghost Rider 77 requesting priority approach. We have a situation that requires Major Morrison's immediate attention. Morrison's head snapped up. Ghost Rider 77 wasn't in the system. He'd been monitoring communications all night. Insomnia was his new companion since the divorce papers arrived, and no aircraft by that designation had filed a flight plan. The duty controller, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked equally puzzled. Ghost Rider 77, Dover Control. State your position and nature of emergency. Negative on the emergency, Dover. We're carrying cargo that specifically requested Major Morrison. He'll understand when he sees us. Morrison's blood ran cold. The last time someone had specifically requested him by name, it had been Colonel Patricia Saber Castellanos, and that mission had gone sideways in ways that still haunted his sleep. Saber had been the most decorated transport pilot in the Air Force before she vanished 6 months ago during what should have been a routine humanitarian supply run to Somalia. The official report listed her as KIA, but Morrison had read between the lines. No body recovered. No wreckage found. Just another ghost in a war that seemed to create more questions than answers. Through the control tower's windows, Morrison spotted the approaching aircraft, a C-130 Hercules, but something was off about its silhouette. The paint scheme was wrong, too dark, and it flew with a precision that suggested either exceptional skill or fly-by-wire technology he didn't recognize. The 4 turboprops hummed with a different pitch than standard Allison T-56 engines. Williams, pull up the registry for Ghost Rider 77. Already tried, sir. Nothing in the database. Not military, not civilian, not international. The aircraft was descending now, landing lights piercing the pre-dawn darkness like searching fingers. Morrison's chest tightened. Emma would be waking up in 3 hours for school, expecting him to drive her as he had every morning since Michelle left. But something about this mysterious C-130 called to a part of him he thought had died with his career. Ghost Rider 77, state your cargo manifest and requesting party. The response came after a long pause, and when it did, Morrison's world tilted on its axis. Dover Control, cargo manifest is classified. Requesting party is Colonel Patricia Castellanos. She says Anchor owes her a favor and it's time to collect. Morrison's hands trembled as he reached for his flight jacket. Saber was alive, and somehow she'd found a way to pull him back into the game he'd been forced to quit. Through the window, the ghost C-130 touched down with barely a whisper, its engine spinning down to an idle that sounded almost like a purr. The aircraft's cargo ramp lowered with hydraulic precision, and a figure emerged from the shadows within. Even at this distance, Morrison recognized the confident stride, the way she carried herself like she owned whatever ground her boots touched. Colonel Patricia Castellanos stepped into the floodlights of Dover Air Force Base, very much alive and apparently very much in need of a pilot she could trust. She looked up at the control tower, and even from 3 stories up, Morrison could see her smile, the same predatory grin she'd worn before every impossible mission they'd flown together in Afghanistan. She raised her hand in a casual salute, then pointed directly at him. The message was clear. Your country needs you, Anchor. One more time. Morrison's discharge papers suddenly felt like kindling in his hands. He thought of Emma, sleeping peacefully in her bed, dreaming of normal things like playground games and birthday parties. Then he thought of Saber, standing alone on that tarmac, carrying secrets that had kept her ghost for 6 months. The choice should have been simple. His daughter needed stability, needed a father who would be there for every scraped knee and parent-teacher conference. But as he watched Saber gesture toward the mysterious C-130, he realized that sometimes being a good father meant ensuring there was still a world worth inheriting. And if Saber had crawled back from whatever hell she'd been living in to specifically request him, then the stakes were higher than his comfortable retirement. Morrison grabbed his jacket and headed for the stairs, each step taking him further from the safe, predictable life he'd planned and closer to whatever classified nightmare had brought his former squadron commander back from the dead. Behind him, his discharge papers fluttered to the floor, forgotten. Anchor was about to discover that in the world of black operations and impossible missions, retirement was rarely permanent. The morning air hit his face like a slap of reality as he crossed the tarmac. Saber stood waiting beside the C-130's ramp, and up close, he could see the changes 6 months of classified hell had carved into her features. New scars traced her jawline, and her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much and lived to carry the burden. "Hello, Anchor," she said, her voice carrying the same authority that had made her a legend. "Hope you weren't getting too comfortable in retirement." "Saber." Morrison stopped just out of arm's reach, still processing the impossibility of her presence. "The report said you were dead. Body never recovered, aircraft destroyed by hostile fire." "Reports have been known to lie." She gestured toward the C-130's open cargo bay. "Especially when the truth would compromise ongoing operations that don't officially exist." Morrison peered into the aircraft's interior and felt his breath catch. The cargo hold had been converted into something resembling a high-tech operations center, complete with satellite communication arrays, tactical displays, and equipment he didn't recognize. 3 other figures worked at various stations, their faces obscured by the shadows and the glow of multiple screens. "What's this about, Patricia?" "It's about finishing what we started in Somalia, Jake. It's about a threat that's bigger than either of us realized. And it's about the fact that you're the only pilot I trust to fly us into the kind of hell that makes Afghanistan look like a training exercise." Morrison thought of Emma again, of the promise he'd made to be present for her childhood. "I'm done, Saber. I've got a daughter who needs her father to stick around. And she's got a country that needs her father to serve one more time." Saber stepped closer, her voice dropping to the intensity he remembered from their most dangerous missions. "The cargo we recovered in Somalia wasn't humanitarian supplies, Jake. It was intelligence about a terrorist network that's planning something that will make 9/11 look like a warm-up act. We're the only ones who know, and we're running out of time to stop it." The weight of her words settled over Morrison like a familiar flight suit. He'd known, somewhere in his gut, that Saber's disappearance had been about more than a simple supply run gone wrong. The woman who'd earned her call sign by cutting through enemy positions like a blade didn't vanish without leaving a trail of answers. "How long?" he asked, already knowing he'd made his decision. 72 hours, maybe less." Saber extended her hand toward the aircraft. "I know what I'm asking, Jake, but there's no one else who can fly this mission, and there's no mission more important." Morrison looked back toward the base, where his daughter slept safely in housing provided by a grateful nation. Then he looked at the mysterious C-130, its engines still whispering secrets into the pre-dawn air. Sometimes the greatest act of love was walking away from the person you loved most, toward a danger that could destroy everything. He reached for his phone to call his sister, Emma's favorite aunt and the only person he trusted with his daughter's care on short notice. "Jenny, it's Jake. I need you to pick up Emma from school today. Something's come up." Saber's smile was equal parts relief and apology. "Thank you, Anchor." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison replied, stepping toward the aircraft that would carry him back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. "Let's see what kind of impossible you've gotten us into this time." The C-130's ramp closed behind them with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing Morrison's fate and launching him toward a mission that would either save countless lives or add his name to the classified casualty lists that families never got to read. As the aircraft lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison caught one last glimpse of Dover Air Force Base shrinking below them. Somewhere in base housing, Emma Morrison slept peacefully, unaware that her father had just volunteered to fly into hell to ensure she could keep sleeping safely. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. To be the father she deserved, he had to risk never being a father again. The C-130 banked sharply to the east, its modified engines carrying them toward the rising sun and whatever classified nightmare awaited. In the cargo hold, Sabre was already briefing her team on mission parameters, her voice cutting through the engine noise with military precision. Morrison settled into the pilot's seat of an aircraft that felt familiar and alien at the same time, its controls responding to his touch like an old friend with new secrets. "Ghost Rider 77 to Dover Control," came the voice of his co-pilot, a woman whose call sign was apparently Razor, and whose competence was immediately evident in how she handled the aircraft's systems. "Departing your airspace. Thanks for the hospitality." "Copy that, Ghost Rider. Safe travels." As they climbed toward cruising altitude, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the young sergeant who'd cleared their departure had no idea he'd just witnessed the beginning of a mission that would either prevent a catastrophe or become one. The C-130 settled into level flight, carrying its crew toward a rendezvous with classified death and the kind of heroism that never made the evening news. Through the windscreen, the sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and gold, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. Morrison had flown toward countless sunrises during his military career, but this one felt different, like the dawn of either salvation or damnation, with no middle ground in between. Behind him, Sabre's voice carried the weight of command and the burden of knowledge that came with clearances above top secret. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have approximately 68 hours to prevent the largest terrorist attack in American history. Failure is not an option, and success might cost us everything." Morrison's hands found their rhythm on the controls, muscle memory taking over as his mind processed the magnitude of what Sabre had just revealed. 68 hours to save America. No pressure at all. He thought of Emma one more time, then pushed her image into the corner of his consciousness, where all the good reasons to stay alive lived during impossible missions. It was time to earn his call sign again, one more time, for the highest stakes he'd ever faced. The C-130 flew eastward into the brightening sky, carrying the weight of a secret mission and the hopes of a nation that would never know their names if they succeeded, and would never forgive their failure if they didn't. The aircraft's modified engines hummed with quiet efficiency, a mechanical lullaby that Morrison had heard on dozens of classified flights over the years. But this time felt different, charged with the electricity of a mission that could redefine the meaning of service and sacrifice. As they crossed into international airspace, Morrison realized he was no longer flying toward retirement. He was flying toward the most important mission of his life. The first phase of their classified odyssey had begun, and already Morrison could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling over his shoulders like an old friend. Sabre had called him back to service, and he'd answered. Now all that remained was to prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in him, and the faith his daughter had in her father's ability to come home safe. The C-130 disappeared into the morning sky, carrying its crew toward a confrontation with evil that would test every skill they'd learned and every principle they held sacred. For Morrison, retirement would have to wait. America needed anchor one more time, and this time, the entire world might hang in the balance. 3 hours into the flight, the true scope of their mission began to reveal itself. Sabre called Morrison back to the cargo hold, where tactical displays showed satellite imagery of locations across 3 continents. The images were crisp, real-time, and painted a picture of coordinated terrorist activity that made Morrison's blood run cold. "This is what we discovered in Somalia," Sabre explained, her finger tracing connection lines between various points of interest. A network calling itself the New Caliphate, funded by sources we're still tracking, with cells active in 7 countries. They're not planning multiple attacks, they're planning simultaneous strikes designed to trigger a global war. Morrison studied the intelligence feeds, his pilot's eye automatically calculating distances, flight times, and logistical requirements. The coordination required for something like this is why they've been planning it for 3 years. Razor looked up from her communication station. "We intercepted enough of their communications to know the timeline, but not enough to know all the targets. What we do know is that the primary strike is scheduled for 72 hours from now, during the G20 summit." The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. The G20 summit brought together the leaders of the world's most powerful nations in one location, protected by security measures that represented the best each country had to offer. If terrorists could successfully strike that target, the psychological impact alone would shatter international confidence and potentially trigger the kind of global conflict that could reshape civilization. "Our mission is to infiltrate the network's primary coordination center, gather intelligence on the remaining targets, and eliminate the command structure before they can execute their plan." Sabre's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen the classified intelligence assessments about what failure would mean. "The location is a fortified compound in the mountains of Afghanistan, about 200 miles from where we used to operate." Morrison felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Afghanistan had been his crucible, the place where he'd earned his reputation as one of the Air Force's most reliable pilots. It was also where he'd lost too many friends and gained too many scars, both visible and otherwise. How fortified? Surface-to-air missile batteries, early warning radar, approximately 200 personnel with military-grade equipment. Razor pulled up tactical assessments on the main display. "It's not going to be a surgical strike. It's going to be a full-scale assault with a very narrow margin for error. And if we fail?" Sabre met his eyes with the unflinching directness that had made her a legend. "If we fail, Jake, millions of people die, and the world order as we know it collapses into chaos. The economic impact alone would trigger a global depression that would make the 1930s look prosperous." Morrison absorbed the weight of that responsibility while mentally calculating the tactical challenges ahead. Flying into Afghanistan was dangerous under the best circumstances. Flying into a fortified terrorist stronghold with a small team and limited backup was the kind of mission that survival manuals advised against. But looking around the cargo hold at Sabre's team, he saw the same quiet competence and deadly focus that had carried them through impossible odds before. "What's the extraction plan?" "We improvise." Sabre's smile held no humor. "Intel suggests the compound has a small airstrip suitable for a C-130, but it's likely to be heavily defended. Our insertion will be the easy part. Getting out alive with the intelligence we need, that's where things get interesting." Morrison nodded, his mind already shifting into mission mode. The comfortable retirement he'd been planning was a luxury the world couldn't afford right now. Emma would have to understand, someday, that her father had chosen to risk everything to ensure she had a future worth living in. The C-130 flew on through the morning sky, its crew preparing for a mission that would either prevent a global catastrophe or add their names to the classified memorial walls where heroes were honored in secret. For Morrison, the choice had been made the moment Sabre stepped out of that aircraft. Some responsibilities transcended personal desire, and some missions defined the meaning of service itself. As they approached their first refueling stop, Morrison realized that his daughter might grow up without a father, but she would grow up in a world where freedom still meant something. That trade-off, as heartbreaking as it was, felt like the most important decision he'd ever made. The modified C-130 touched down at a classified airfield somewhere over the Atlantic, its location scrubbed from official records, and its existence known only to those with clearances that didn't technically exist. The refueling took place in silence, conducted by ground crew who wore no identifying patches and asked no questions. Morrison watched through the cockpit windows as fuel trucks approached with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed ballet, their operators moving with the practiced anonymity of people, accustomed to missions that never happened. During the brief ground stop, Sabre pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation that revealed the full scope of what they were facing. The intelligence they'd gathered in Somalia painted a picture of terrorist coordination that went beyond anything previously imagined. The new caliphate wasn't just planning attacks. They were planning to trigger a cascading series of events that would destabilize global markets, collapse international alliances, and create the chaos necessary for their twisted vision of a new world order. The financial markets are more interconnected than most people realize, Sabre explained, showing Morrison classified economic analyses. A successful attack on the G20 summit, combined with simultaneous strikes on key infrastructure targets, could trigger a global economic collapse within hours. The psychological impact would be immediate, but the practical consequences would last for decades. Morrison studied the projections, each graph and chart representing millions of lives that would be upended by the kind of cascading economic disaster that turned prosperous nations into failed states. How did they get this sophisticated? Money, time, and help from sources were still identifying. Sabre closed the classified folder with the kind of finality that suggested some secrets were too dangerous to share even among trusted allies. What matters now is stopping them before they can execute their plan. As they prepared for the next phase of their journey, Morrison called his sister to check on Emma. The conversation was brief, coded in the casual language of a father who couldn't explain why he wouldn't be home for dinner. Emma was fine, excited about a school project, and completely unaware that her father was flying toward a mission that could determine the future of civilization itself. "Tell her I love her," Morrison said before ending the call, the words carrying more weight than usual. "She knows," Jenny replied, her voice suggesting she understood more about Jake's sudden departure than he'd told her. The C-130 lifted off again, this time heading directly toward the operational theater where Morrison's past and present would collide in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The flight path took them over terrain that held too many memories, places where he'd flown combat missions, evacuation runs, and humanitarian supplies to people caught in the crossfire of wars they hadn't started. But this mission felt different from anything he'd flown before. The stakes were higher, the margin for error smaller, and the consequences of failure too catastrophic to contemplate. As they crossed into contested airspace, Morrison felt the familiar hyper-awareness that came with flying in harm's way. Every radar contact was a potential threat, every radio transmission a possible indication of hostile intent. Ghost Rider 77, be advised you are approaching contested airspace. Recommend altitude change to avoid known surface-to-air threats. Copy that, Control, climbing to flight level 300. The C-130 climbed steadily, its modified engines performing flawlessly despite the additional weight of the specialized equipment they carried. Morrison found himself appreciating the subtle improvements someone had made to this aircraft. The controls responded with precision that exceeded standard specifications, and the engine performance curves suggested modifications that weren't available through normal procurement channels. "Whoever modified this bird knew what they were doing," he commented to Razor, who had proven herself to be an exceptionally skilled co-pilot. Sabre has connections that don't appear on any organizational chart, Razor replied. This aircraft officially doesn't exist, which gives us capabilities that officially aren't possible. As they approached their target region, the reality of what they were attempting began to crystallize. They were flying a ghost aircraft on a mission that didn't officially exist, carrying intelligence that could prevent a global catastrophe, with backup that wouldn't be acknowledged if things went wrong. It was the kind of operation that required not just exceptional skill, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause that history might never record. Morrison thought of Emma one more time, then pushed personal concerns aside and focused on the mission ahead. The C-130 flew on toward Afghanistan, carrying its crew toward a confrontation with evil that would test every skill they possessed and every principle they held sacred. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Morrison of all the beautiful sunsets he'd shared with his daughter. But this sunset marked the end of his comfortable retirement and the beginning of the most dangerous mission of his life. As night fell over the mountains of Afghanistan, Ghost Rider 77 disappeared into the darkness, carrying the hopes of a world that would never know their names. The approach to the target zone required flying through mountain passes that Morrison remembered from his previous deployments, terrain that looked beautiful from altitude but concealed dangers that could destroy an unwary aircraft in seconds. The C-130's terrain-following radar painted a picture of peaks and valleys that required constant attention and split-second decisions. This was flying at its most demanding, where pilot skill and aircraft performance combined to determine the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Terrain, terrain, the aircraft's warning system announced as they descended through a particularly narrow pass. "I see it," Morrison replied, his hands steady on the controls as he guided the C-130 between rock walls that seemed close enough to touch. This was the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, and Morrison felt the familiar satisfaction of pushing both himself and his aircraft to the limits of their capabilities. Sabre moved forward into the cockpit as they approached the final phase of their infiltration route. The compound is 15 minutes ahead. Intelligence suggests they're expecting a supply flight tonight, which should provide cover for our insertion. And if they're not expecting us, then we improvise, adapt, and overcome. Sabre's smile carried the confidence of someone who had survived more impossible situations than most people could imagine. "That's what we do, Anchor." Morrison nodded, his attention focused on the tactical approach that would get them close enough to the terrorist compound to deploy Sabre's team without being detected by the defensive systems that protected the facility. The flight plan required precision navigation, perfect timing, and a significant measure of luck. All three were in short supply. As the C-130 descended toward its target, Morrison realized that this mission represented more than just another classified operation. It was a test of everything he'd learned during 22 years of military service, a validation of the skills that had earned him his call sign, and potentially the most important flight of his life. The compound appeared ahead, its lights visible against the dark mountainside like a malignant constellation. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he began the final approach that would either deliver Sabre's team to their objective or announce their presence to defenders who would respond with lethal force. "Ghost Rider 77 beginning final approach," Morrison announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The C-130 descended through the mountain air, carrying its crew toward a confrontation with terrorist forces that threatened the stability of the entire world. For Morrison, this was no longer about retirement or personal choice. It was about service to a cause larger than himself, and the responsibility that came with having the skills to make a difference when the stakes couldn't be higher. The aircraft's landing lights illuminated the improvised airstrip ahead, and Morrison began the delicate process of bringing his Ghost aircraft down in hostile territory, trusting in his training, his aircraft, and the exceptional crew that had volunteered for this impossible mission. As the wheels touched down on foreign soil, Morrison realized that the easy part of their mission was over. Now the real work would begin, and the world's future hung in the balance of what happened in the next few hours. The C-130 rolled to a stop in the darkness, its engines spooling down to idle as Saber's team prepared to deploy into the night. Morrison's job was to get them here safely, and somehow, against all odds, to get them out alive when the mission was complete. The cargo ramp lowered with mechanical precision, revealing the dark landscape of Afghanistan and the compound that held the intelligence they desperately needed. Saber's team moved with professional efficiency, their equipment checks conducted in the kind of silence that meant the difference between success and death. 30 minutes, Anchor, Saber said as she prepared to lead her team into the night. If we're not back by then, assume we're compromised and get out of here. Morrison watched as they disappeared into the darkness, carrying with them the hopes of preventing a global catastrophe. The C-130 sat silent on the improvised runway, its engines idling quietly while Morrison maintained radio silence and monitored the tactical situation. Somewhere in the compound ahead, Saber and her team were attempting the impossible, and all he could do was wait and be ready for whatever came next. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, each second bringing them closer to either mission success or catastrophic failure. Morrison's hands remained steady on the controls, ready to execute an emergency takeoff if the situation went wrong. But inside, he was counting heartbeats and calculating odds, hoping that his trust in Saber's capabilities wasn't misplaced. At exactly 28 minutes, the radio crackled to life with Saber's voice, steady and professional despite whatever hell she'd just walked through. "Ghost Rider, this is Saber. We've got what we came for, but we've got company. Recommend immediate departure." Morrison's hands were already moving before she finished speaking, the C-130's engine spooling up to full power as he prepared for the kind of takeoff that would either save their lives or kill them all. The aircraft began to roll forward, gathering speed on the rough runway as tracer fire began to light up the night behind them. "Hold on back there," Morrison called as the C-130 lifted off into the darkness, climbing rapidly away from the compound that was now fully alert to their presence. Below them, muzzle flashes and the bright streaks of surface-to-air missiles painted deadly patterns against the mountainside. The modified C-130 climbed with surprising agility, its enhanced engines providing the power needed to escape the engagement envelope of the defensive systems. Morrison flew with instinctive precision, using every trick he'd learned during 22 years of military aviation to keep his aircraft and crew alive. "Missile launch, 3 o'clock, Razor called out, her eyes fixed on the threat detection display. Morrison banked sharply left, the C-130 responding with the kind of agility that shouldn't have been possible for an aircraft of its size. The surface-to-air missile streaked past their starboard wing, its proximity fuse detonating just close enough to rattle the airframe without causing critical damage. "That was too close," Morrison muttered, continuing his evasive maneuvers as they climbed away from the threat zone. "But not close enough," Saber replied from the cargo hold, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. "We've got the intelligence we need, Anchor. Now let's get it to people who can use it." As they reached safe altitude and turned toward friendly airspace, Morrison allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had successfully penetrated one of the most heavily defended terrorist compounds in the world, extracted critical intelligence, and escaped with their lives. But the mission was far from over. Now they had to get that intelligence to the right people in time to prevent the attacks that could reshape the world. The C-130 flew through the night sky, carrying its crew and their precious cargo toward a rendezvous with forces that could use the intelligence to prevent global catastrophe. Morrison's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind was already calculating the challenges ahead. They had won the first phase of their mission, but the real test was still to come. Behind them, the terrorist compound burned against the mountainside, a small victory against forces that threatened everything Morrison held dear. Ahead lay the greatest challenge of his career, using the intelligence they'd gathered to prevent an attack that could change the course of history itself. The flight toward their next destination took them over terrain that Morrison knew well from his previous deployments, but this time, the familiar landmarks carried different meaning. They weren't flying toward another routine mission. They were carrying intelligence that could prevent the kind of terrorist attack that would redefine the meaning of security and freedom for generations to come. Sabre worked in the cargo hold with her team, analyzing the intelligence they'd extracted from the compound's computer systems. The data painted a picture of terrorist planning that exceeded their worst estimates, with coordination between cells that spanned continents and resources that suggested state-level support. The primary target is confirmed as the G20 summit, Sabre reported as she joined Morrison in the cockpit. But they're also planning simultaneous strikes on financial centers in New York, London, and Tokyo. The goal isn't just casualties, it's complete economic collapse. Morrison absorbed the implications while maintaining his focus on flying the aircraft through increasingly congested airspace. They were approaching the operational area, where the intelligence would be handed off to forces capable of acting on it. But the handoff itself presented its own set of challenges. The coordination required for something like this suggests they have inside information, Razor observed, her analysis of the intercepted communications revealing patterns that shouldn't have been possible. They know details about security arrangements that aren't available to the general public. The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If the terrorist network had access to classified security information, then the defensive measures being planned for the G20 summit might be compromised from the beginning. The intelligence they'd risked their lives to gather was valuable, but it also revealed the scope of the betrayal that had made such detailed planning possible. As they approached their destination, Morrison felt the weight of responsibility that came with carrying intelligence that could save millions of lives or, if mishandled, could compromise the very people they were trying to protect. The next few hours would determine whether their mission had been worth the risk, and whether the sacrifices they'd made would prevent the global catastrophe that seemed increasingly inevitable. The C-130 began its descent toward another classified airfield, this one located somewhere in friendly territory where the intelligence could be properly analyzed and disseminated to the agencies responsible for preventing the attacks. Morrison's job was almost finished. He had successfully transported Sabre's team to their target, supported their extraction, and was now delivering the fruits of their labor to people who could act on it. But as they touched down at the secure facility, Morrison realized that his involvement in this mission was far from over. The intelligence they'd gathered was too important, and his skills too valuable, for him to simply return to retirement while others fought the battle he'd helped initiate. The world had changed in the past 24 hours, and so had Morrison's role in protecting it. As the C-130's engine spun down, Morrison looked out at the secure facility where analysts and operators were waiting to receive the intelligence that could prevent global catastrophe. He thought of Emma, safe in her school routine and unaware of how close the world had come to changing forever. Then he thought of his duty to ensure that her world remained safe, whatever the personal cost. The cargo ramp lowered to reveal teams of intelligence professionals ready to process the data Sabre's team had risked everything to obtain. Morrison watched as classified files and computer drives were transferred with the kind of careful handling reserved for materials that could change the course of history. The analysis will take several hours, Sabre explained as they prepared to debrief the mission. But preliminary examination suggests we've identified at least 4 of the planned attack sites, along with the timing and coordination protocols. It was progress, but Morrison could see in Saber's expression that it wasn't enough. The terrorist network was too large, too well-funded, and too carefully planned to be stopped by conventional counterterrorism measures. They had gathered critical intelligence, but preventing the attacks would require something more decisive and more dangerous than anything they'd attempted so far. "What's the next phase?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We take the fight directly to their leadership," Saber replied, her voice carrying the kind of determination that had made her a legend in special operations circles. "The intelligence we gathered includes the location of their primary command center, along with the identities of the key personnel coordinating the attacks." Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he realized what Saber was suggesting. They weren't just gathering intelligence anymore. They were preparing to launch a direct action mission against the terrorist leadership, the kind of high-risk operation that could either prevent a global catastrophe or trigger the very conflict they were trying to prevent. As teams of analysts began processing the intelligence they'd risked their lives to gather, Morrison found himself once again facing a choice between personal safety and service to a cause larger than himself. Emma needed her father, but the world needed Anchor, and the balance between those two responsibilities was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The secure facility buzzed with activity as intelligence professionals worked around the clock to analyze the data and develop actionable plans. Morrison watched the organized chaos of counterterrorism operations, remembering why he'd chosen military service in the first place. Some fights were too important to leave to others, and some responsibilities transcended personal desire. As the sun rose over the classified compound, Morrison realized that his comfortable retirement would have to wait a little longer. The world was facing a threat that required the best people doing the hardest jobs, and whether he liked it or not, he was one of those people. The intelligence analysis revealed the full scope of the terrorist network's planning, and the picture that emerged was more sophisticated and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The new caliphate wasn't just planning multiple attacks. They were orchestrating a coordinated campaign designed to trigger a global war that would create the chaos necessary for their twisted vision of the future. "The financial targets are designed to trigger market panic," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead intelligence analyst assigned to process the captured data. "Simultaneous attacks on the New York Stock Exchange, the London Financial District, and the Tokyo markets would create a cascade effect that could collapse the global economy within hours." Morrison studied the targeting data while mentally calculating the flight times and logistical requirements necessary to prevent such coordinated strikes. The terrorists had chosen their targets with sophisticated understanding of global financial systems, and their timing was designed to maximize psychological impact and minimize response time. "The G20 summit is the catalyst," Saber added, pointing to intercepts that revealed the true scope of the